I'm just tweeting out what we're doing. Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us for the final day of our series called A More Perfect Union, our 3-day virtual festival. We've been very fortunate to have a terrific group of speakers over the past 2 days, and we continue the streak today with leading health officials, civil rights activists, members of Congress, and many more joining us to discuss our nation's pursuit of a more perfect union. That's what we should be doing. Just as we've been for the last 2 days, we're going to be bringing you multiple sessions of programming, and each day is divided into 3 segments. First is Rise. That's what we're doing now. Then there's Focus in the afternoon, and then finally Reveal. Today's segments will take a deep dive into advancing justice in society, protecting against cyber threats, the future of education, and moving our health systems forward. All of these issues matter. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Microsoft and Southern Company, for their support of this festival and these conversations. And before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events, but more importantly is the hashtag. The hashtag is #TheHillAMPU. That's The Hill, A More Perfect Union. We're broadcasting live, and we'll take your questions throughout the program. I use them, so please send them to me, and I will pose them to the folks we're talking to. And if you experience any trouble with the live stream, don't clobber your computer. Just refresh the page. We begin today with a look at the state of equality and justice across the nation and the steps that could lead to meaningful change. We're going to hear from leading activists and changemakers for a conversation on catalyzing systemic change and advancing justice at all levels of society, or at least we hope. I'm especially happy to be joined by my great colleague from the newsroom, Eris Foley, to help lead these conversations. She's very cool, much cooler than I am. Eris, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Excited to be here. To get things off, I'm going to be joined by Janet Mergia, the president and CEO of Unidos US, the nation's largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization. Welcome, Janet.
Okay, hold on. Yeah, go ahead, Janet. Bring the camera back. Hi, Janet. I just need to say hello. Okay, now go back to what you're doing.
Hi, Janet.
So, hey.
How are you?
Wonderful. Trying to keep up with all the fast-moving developments on Capitol Hill today.
Right. There's a lot. I know that among a list of issues your organization has long advocated for is education equity, and you recently met with Secretary of Education, Dr. Miguel Cardona. What are some of the things that you spoke to him about?
Well, we were first really excited to host Dr. Miguel Cardona, a Latino education secretary, and someone who has actually come from a history of being a teacher, a school principal, and an administrator, and working with an inclusive racial equity lens. So it was really exciting. But we were able to talk to him about some of the most challenging issues we're seeing for children of color, students of color, but in particular Latino students. And college completion has been one of the biggest challenges. We made a lot of progress in the last decade with high school graduation rates, and we're seeing our students transition to college, but what's happening is they're not fully able to complete college. And that's why a lot of the community college bridging that happens is so critically important for Latino students, and making sure they have the supports that they need to make sure they're getting the credits that they can when they transfer from college, community college, to a 4-year institution, but also just making sure they end up with that degree. And that's not happening. A lot of them are falling out in college. So with the recent pandemic, there's even been more challenges as students have had not as many supports as they should when they've been trying to study from home. And so we talked about a number of those issues related to college completion, but also just language issues. There's still a lot of English learners that are 20% of the K through 12 student body in this country, and we just need to make sure those supports are there for them to fully succeed. So a number of issues.
Right. And I mean, how should we be investing in our nation's students, do you think, in a way that would be both equitable and inclusive?
Well, for us, I think it starts with making sure there is leadership at the national level and making sure that we do have a secretary and administration that understands those supports are important. So the funding for higher education becomes really important, those supports. And I know that in this Build Back Better package, they're talking about some of the investments for minority serving institutions as well, like HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions, tribal colleges, all of those are going to be particularly important because they have a lot of the understanding and supports for those students, but obviously just investments in making sure we can have college completion is really important. And again, different titles of the Higher Education Act are important, but we also want to make sure there's investments in K through 12 that are supporting those students either through help with supports for language and English language learners.
Right. And I know that Democrats, as you said before, are currently working on this massive reconciliation plan to enact chunks of the president's Build Back Better agenda. Your organization has been among the groups that have been helping lead the charge on trying to keep immigration reform in the reconciliation package. What is your message to Congress right now on building back better with regards to immigration reform in the budget reconciliation plan?
Well, Eris, as you know, there were a number of Latinos and immigrants who stepped up as essential workers during the pandemic. In fact, we know that only 16% of Latinos and Latinas were able to work from home during the pandemic, and that 70% of Hispanics made up essential workers. Many of them contributed in important ways, but many of them are part of immigrant families. And we saw immigrants uniquely step up, even though it was a great risk to their lives and their families, but they kept the economy going. So we think it's important for us to invest in that workforce and make sure they have a full opportunity to contribute. And what that means is that we have to include immigration path to citizenship for those workers. Not only did they earn that path to citizenship by responding in the country's darkest moment to keep our economy going, but what we learned is we're going to continue to need those workers. And so it's not fair to have them have to look over their shoulder after many of them have been here for over a generation, and make sure that we can secure that workforce because we're going to need it to have a full economic recovery. So we're hopeful that in the House, I know passed bill, we saw inclusions that would have path to citizenship. We hope that that it's included in the current framework right now, and we need to make sure that it stays in that framework, especially as we go to the Senate, where the parliamentarian has a key role.
Right.
But for us, our message is there are tools to address this from a legislative mechanics, and we have to see once and for all these workers be able to continue to stay and work and have that path to citizenship. So we're counting and we're expecting that to be in the final, not just framework, but in the final legislation that is signed into law. And we've certainly been advocating it. It's the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do from a business and economic recovery standpoint.
Right. And I know that it's been decades since major immigration reform has been enacted. So I'm just curious, if immigration reform isn't tackled in this reconciliation plan, do you think it's likely we'll see major immigration reform maybe taken up through another vehicle in the near future? Or is this current plan, do you think, in your opinion, the best shot?
This is our best shot, and there's no reason why we couldn't get this provision finally in this bill. The bottom line is, Eris, we're not going to take no for an answer. We need to see this kind of relief and protections and ability for these workers to continue to contribute in a recovery where we're going to need them. So this is the shot that we need to take. And your answer is we're never going to give up. We're going to continue to fight for a path to citizenship. It's the right and smart thing to do. This is the best and most appropriate way and vehicle for us to get this relief when we need it most, for not just the community, but for the country to be able to have economic prosperity. We need this workforce right now. They've proven themselves, as we saw them really come through for the country during the pandemic, but we're going to need them for the future. And that economic prosperity will rely on them. We need to get that path of citizenship so these workers can know that they can be fully integrated into society and be full contributors.
Well, thank you so much. It was great hearing from you, and thank you for your insight just on this matter in general. Great talking to you.
Sure, Eris, and please tell Steve, my fellow Kansan, I said hello, okay?
Thanks, Janet. You know, I was very jealous when I came in this morning and saw that Aris got you today. And like, I always love our conversations. And so anyway, I had to cede the floor to my friend Aris, but thanks so much for joining us as well, Janet.
Of course. Thank you all.
Deborah Archer is the president of the American Civil Liberties Union and is the first black woman to hold this position in the organization's 101-year history. She's also a tenured professor and the co-faculty director at the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law at NYU Law. Deborah, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. Let me ask you kind of a tough meta question at the beginning. I saw the tweet that you just shared. It was called Race in America. The judge needs to be reminded that his victims are not on trial. And this had to do with the framing of those victims. I'm going to call them victims of Kyle Rittenhouse, where the judge in that case decided that victim is too loaded a word, but let the lawyers call them rioters, looters, or arsonists. I guess the question I have from this and just reading this is, the ACLU pursues everyone's rights because there's a fundamental faith that the legal system will somehow deliver and be strong and impervious and come out right in the end. And I often ask people who are on, I won't call it, on the side of the equation in America where they've been neglected or demeaned or left alone, do they trust the system to deliver? So my question to you is really about the legal infrastructure of this country. Do you trust it to perform in a way that delivers?
So thank you for having me, and that's a good question. I think, yes, fundamentally, as someone who is a lawyer and engages in the legal process, that I believe that at the end of the day, that if we push and pull and fight and engage within our legal system, that we're going to see change. But of course, the legal system has not only been a source and tool for justice and equity, it's also been a source and tool for the inequality and oppression that we see. So although our legal system, I think, is an important tool for advancing civil rights and civil liberties, it's not the only tool. And so the work that we do has to include the legal advocacy, but also building power and capacity in our communities. It has to include engaging in legislative reform and policy reform, public education. We certainly, in order to move the needle towards more justice, particularly in the areas of racial justice, use all the tools that are available to us.
Another thing, there's this, some media organizations, the ones that I admire, have a brand. It's a very respectful brand. It's sort of been, I don't know where it came from originally, but it's all the news without fear or favor. And I always looked at ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, as a place where it was like everyone's rights without fear or favor. And sometimes that meant defending uncomfortable moments, for some people who looked at, people charged with crimes, habeas corpus, certain issues like that. And I've always admired ACLU, which to many people seems like a progressive organization defending everyone across the board. I'm just sort of interested in how is, as we look forward in this notion of a more perfect union, is that scaffolding still there?
Absolutely, 100%. I think it's important. We believe that we are working to make sure that we, the people, means all of us, regardless of our beliefs and our positions. We all have rights that should be respected and protected. I think that we believe that fighting for equality and fighting for freedom are two sides of the same coin, that you can't have one without the other, that you cannot effectively enjoy one without the other. So our work is to make sure that we are defending everyone's rights. And that is certainly a challenge for one organization to try to make sure that we are engaging in a way where we, the people, will mean all of us, that no one is excluded, that no one's rights are sacrificed, that no one feels like they are left out of our system and that they don't have someone who's fighting for them. Sometimes that is more challenging than other times. Certainly there are areas where rights may be in tension, but I don't think that that means that any right is prioritized over any other, because again, it's important that we're fighting to protect all of our rights.
So let me ask you another mega question. I'm really enjoying, being able to talk with you. I hope you'll want to come back, because these are things in my mind. One of my colleagues, my former colleagues at, when I was at the Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates, he wrote Beyond the World and Me, but he also wrote about the history of redlining in this country, about how, essentially, the legacy of systemic racism in this country meant that a lot of people in this country benefited when those that built the early foundations of the United States economically and in many other ways, the architecture of this country, were built on the backs of slaves. And so I think part of the question is, should we, in our modern shape that we're in, pay back? And I'm just wondering, is there such a thing as historic property rights that we should begin thinking about reparations or beginning to deal with that? And I'm interested in, from a legal framework, ACLU, I'm interested in ACLU of ever picking this up. Can something like that of restoring rights to people whose legacy were clearly victims in the past be fixed? You've written really great stuff until you wrote White Men's Roads Through Black Men's Homes, Advancing Racial Equity Through Highway Reconstruction. But I want to go further than that. So help me understand what might be possible.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to understand the connections from the past to today, that we didn't just plop into this year and the inequalities miraculously appeared. They've been built over time. It is systemic. And as we work to make sure that we are unraveling the systems of inequality and injustice, we certainly have to look back. And one way to think about it, at least the way we think about it at the ACLU in the context of our racial justice work, is first, as you said, we do need to reconcile with the past. The scars created by hundreds of years of chattel slavery, by Jim Crow, by racially discriminatory government policies are deep. They're going to require real resources and investments in communities that have been harmed. And here that work has to include advancing the conversation about reparations, what that means, the full breadth of what reparations might mean. It also means challenging the laws that perpetuate racial inequality, that started with government-backed laws and policies that mandated that equality, particularly around housing, education, and the criminal legal system. But we certainly can't stop there. We have to look forward. And I think that includes work to extend empowerment. The barriers to full participation in the democratic process undermine Black and Brown voters' true political power. The work here would include protecting and expanding voting rights. It includes a focus on ensuring fair redistricting processes. It includes challenging voter suppression bills, but also forward-looking work that helps expand access to democracy, particularly for communities who have been traditionally marginalized. And I think it includes building prosperity. The gaps in wealth between Black and white households exposes accumulated inequality and discrimination, as you said, as well as differences in power and opportunity that can be traced back to this nation's inception. We have to remove those barriers. And finally, I would just say, if we're looking at traditionally how we have entrenched inequality, we have to work to increase access and in order to level the playing field so that every person can achieve their highest potential. We have to ensure access to the tools necessary to thrive. That includes challenging inequality that we see at the intersection of race, class, and place, that the redlining, the segregation, because we can't separate the places people have access to from the opportunities that people have access to.
Jeremy, let me ask you another question, and I don't know how to frame this, but it's one of these questions I sometimes think we learn by asking ourselves uncomfortable questions. And so one of the big uncomfortable things for me is January 6th and how to frame it. And meeting and talking, seeing that day happen, an insurrection, I call an insurrection. And I know, and I think that from my perspective, folks, there were people there who helped design, planned, and knew exactly what was going on. But I also think there were people who were attracted to this because they believe strongly in that. So there's this interesting tension between those who attacked the Capitol and those who went to the Stop the Steal because it's what they believed and they wanted to express their freedom. And sometimes you look at that freedom of expression element. And I'm interested in how, when we look at it, the importance of defending that freedom of expression, even in the sacred act of looking at transferring power. And I'm just wondering if ACLU has had discussions around it, because it must be complicated.
No, as you said earlier, fundamental to who we are as an organization and fundamental to our work is protecting freedom of speech. It's important for all of the fights that we are engaged in. But we do believe that there's a line between a violent uprising, attempt to overthrow the government, and exercising our freedom of speech. I think when we think about what happened on January 6th, a lot of it is about a resistance to a country that is more diverse than it has ever been before, a resistance to sharing the wealth of this nation in terms of access and opportunity and resources. And we can't really move forward past that day. We can't move forward past the other conversations and issues that are dividing our country until we acknowledge the harms, heal those harms, we acknowledge the true motivation behind those. We know this from South Africa, Rwanda, Germany. There was truth before there was reconciliation. And here in the United States, we have a long way to go, because right now we are very far from having a conversation that acknowledges truth and reality, a conversation that acknowledges the harms. In fact, if you look at things like the reaction to the 1619 Project, to anti-racism teaching, to what happened on January 6th, rather than acknowledging harm, the forces of retrenchment are doubling down and denying that those harms even took place. And I think the nature of some of those debates are dividing us. It's going to be hard to overcome. I think about James Baldwin, who said, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." And so I believe that equality is at the core of who we are, fundamental American value. Freedom should be an issue of universal concern. It shouldn't be divisive. Equality and equity should be an issue of universal concern. It shouldn't be divisive. And we have to start with acknowledging that before we can move forward.
Right. And James Baldwin is one of my real heroes. I got to slip in one more. Everybody's telling me we're out of time, but I got to slip in one more. Okay. Everybody around criminal justice reform, levels of incarceration, is patting themselves on the back on what got done during the, the Trump administration, bipartisan support for that. I'm like looking at it and I said, really, you think that's a big deal? I'm just wondering what's the leftover agenda when it comes to criminal justice reform and the huge levels of incarcerated Black and brown people that remain in the U.S. prison system. What do we do to move on that? What are you doing to move on that?
You said what's left. All of it's left, right? We've had really important conversations about racialized police violence, about racial disparities in our carceral system. And we've opened up a window that has led to these conversations, but not a lot of meaningful movement. We've seen proposals and plans that can move us in the right direction to eliminate some of the racial inequalities in our criminal legal system, to put an end or reduce police violence, to fundamentally transform how we view public safety in our communities. But we ultimately have not seen many results. So I think all of the work is yet to be done. Still so much work to be done.
Well, Deborah Archer, president of the American Civil Liberties Union, thank you so much for sharing your views with us today and, being in our big program on A More Perfect Union. Thanks for talking with us.
Thank you for having me.
Joining me now is Tarana Burke, author, activist, and founder of the global Me Too movement for survivors of sexual assault. She's become a global leader in the evolving conversation around sexual violence and the need for survivor-centered, survivor-led solutions. Tarana, it's a real honor to talk with you today. And you and I have talked before about the fact that the Me Too movement that a lot of folks know didn't start, with Hollywood. This has been something you started way, way back when, I think almost 15 years ago, of laying the groundwork and the scaffolding on how to get justice injected and accountability brought to sexual violence, sexual crimes, if you will. And I'd love you to give our audience an understanding of the journey you've been on since you founded Me Too.
Sure. Well, it's nice to talk to you again.
Yeah.
I started in about 2005, 2006. Really before that, before we had a name, I was doing youth work in Alabama. I'm from New York, but I went to college in Alabama and was part of a group there. But the work I was doing was really with community children, with young people in the community who had started off in my leadership program. And as I worked with the girls in particular, I kept finding more and more and more stories of sexual violence. And sometimes it would be stories that they didn't even realize were sexual violence that they had experienced. And as a survivor myself, it became clear that I needed to do something to fill the void. There were no resources, there was no conversation, there was just nothing happening to support the survivors of sexual violence that were there, that were the children. But even beyond that, my training as an organizer in that community and in general said that when there is a community problem, there should be community solutions. And there was nobody talking about what was the solution for this. How do we grapple with so many young people who have dealt with sexual violence? And as I started to develop Me Too as a program, and really started as workshops that grew into a program and eventually into movement work, it spread to adults, and I got to see firsthand just the breadth and depth of how sexual violence affects all of us in this country. And it became crystal clear that if we don't build a movement to end sexual violence, and interrupt sexual violence, and to support survivors, then we are going to be in a really, really, really worse off position in 10 or 15 or 20 years from now.
Tarana, you've just released your personal memoir, Unbound. I'll tell our audience, get it. Unbound, My Story of Liberation and the Birth of the Me Too Movement. And I don't know how to ask this, but I'm going to ask it. I said, I've known people who were victims of sexual violence, and that trauma that they experienced, and the fear of stigma, a lot of different dimensions to it, that it's so hard to turn from being a victim to coming out and being public and activist. It's more than just chasing who the perpetrators was. There's nothing. I'd love our audience to know what you went through to move from the side of the equation of being a victim and demeaned and all the issues you went through to becoming who you are today, of helping others find their way out of this nightmare.
Yeah, well, I was first sexually assaulted at 7. So this is a piece of trauma and violence that I've been carrying in my body for 40 years. And in that journey, and which I'm still on, I want to be clear with people that there's no sort of end result. This is a continuing journey. I had to go through a lot of healing work, personal healing work, that involved me doing sort of excavation, if you will, in my own life, to confront the trauma that I experienced, to confront the violence, but also to kind of slowly roll back the idea that it was my fault, that I should bear the shame and the guilt of what happened to me, because I didn't ask for it, right? And nobody does. And so that journey, going through that journey and watching young people who didn't have the benefit of those resources or the information I had, made me even more compelled to want to bring this to my community, right? There are all these things that exist out in the world to support survivors. Many of them never touch people who need them because they can't afford them, because they don't have access or information. And so I used my journey and what I went through and the issues I had, the gaps in resources that I experienced, to build an understanding of what was necessary to build a movement that really supported survivors. And that's why I talk a lot about what we saw after #MeToo went viral, although it amplified the movement in sexual violence, it really pushed focus to the wrong people. We forget that 12 million people responded to that hashtag in 24 hours, and yet we keep attributing the Me Too movement to celebrities and to perpetrators and people who cause harm, when in fact we wouldn't have a movement if it wasn't for the very brave, very bold, and probably very scared survivors who decided to share their journey with us, and then looked around and said, oh my gosh, this happened to so many other people. People are looking for community. It's what I was looking for on my journey. It's what I tried to build when I started Me Too, and it's what we've seen happen over the last 4 years.
You and I talked in Washington, D.C., and you were given a tribute when I was here one night for dinner, and I'm just interested in, I'm going to be blunt. I mean, I think anyone listening to your story, hearing this story, is going to, their emotional, dimensions are going to be stirred up, and they're going to be with you. But when it comes to public policy, when it comes to law, when it comes to legislators, both sides of the aisle, what's that picture like? Are the railroad tracks aligning, when it comes to law and help and resources and the policy world to the world you're writing about?
Let me explain something. The thing that people don't get is that the sexual violence itself is so broad that it needs multiple interventions.
Right.
And so while we need people to be working on healing modalities for survivors, we need to be talking about resources to survivors and communities, but we have to have things happening on different levels, which means we need policy, we need laws, and we need people who will enforce those laws and who will enact those policies. We need that to happen at the same time that we have resources going to the people who are fighting sexual violence on the ground. And those things aren't aligning. This is not a partisan issue. There should be no two sides of the issue of ending sexual violence at all. It doesn't matter how you vote and how you align politically. This is an issue that doesn't discriminate. And so this should be a place where we come together. I actually felt really naive because people kept saying when it went viral, oh, there's going to be a backlash. And I thought, well, what's the opposite argument, right? If I say I want consent, what are you going to say? No, but I have been mortified to see the way that politicians have responded and used this issue to their benefit on both sides of the aisle when it suits them. But when those of us who are fighting for justice, for survivors, fighting for legislation, fighting for policy, when we need them, when it's not useful, we don't have the same kind of response. So no, you can't adjudicate healing, and you can't, legislate saving people from sexual violence. But everything that people can do who have power, they need to be doing. If you can pass a law, if you can create a policy, you need to not just do it, but you need to enact it when it's done. And then people need to embody the spirit of those laws, right? You can't just, we saw this with Cuomo, right? You can't just pass a law and then act the way you want to. You have to, as a lead, what we need from our leadership are examples of accountability, and they need to embody the ethos and the spirit of the same laws that they're putting into place. So until we have that, we have some work to do on the political front when it comes to sexual violence.
Well, it's very powerful, and this is too short a period of time. I just want to commend you on your book and commend you on your story and what you did so many years before, and the elevation of the Me Too movement in the authentic way at the beginning in 2006 and so on. Tarana Burke, it's such a pleasure. Tarana Burke, author, activist, and founder of the Global Me Too movement. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of our first segment today. A big thank you to our sponsors, Microsoft and Southern Company, and all of you for watching. Really big thanks to Eris Foley as well for joining me. She was fun, and I look forward to having her back. We're going to be back at 2 p.m. for our Focus segment. It's the second segment today, a band of great programming, and we're going to be focusing on securing energy networks from digital threats and feature Allison Clements, Commissioner of the FERC, Senator Mark Warner, and more. Meet us right back here at 2 p.m. Eastern. See you then.